Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and we've had a lot of episodes on addiction and addiction recovery, but today's guest has probably, if I'm not mistaken, the record for the longest time addicted out of all the guests we've had on the show. So today's episode is going to be a very powerful one in the sense that a lot of people feel like after a certain point in time, there's no more hope. That they've always been in addiction, so they're going to stay in addiction. Or once you're an addict for a couple of years, then that's it. You're always going to be one. But we're here with a man who was addicted for over 2 decades, which is a long time. That's a good portion of our lives. And so I want the focus today to be that it's never too late. I think that's one of the most important messages I've always put forward when it comes to addiction recovery. It's important for you as the addicted individual to know, but especially as the people supporting an addicted loved one, trying to get them help, you have to always have that hope that it's not too late either. So, without further ado, Mr. Damien Bloss here to speak with you on your story of addiction and recovery to break the silence. I'd love for you to go ahead and introduce yourself for us, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you also for having me on. Yeah, my name is Damien Bloss. And like you said, it was over 2 decades that I was in active addiction. 20 years, 20 plus years. I started to basically self-destruct when I was about 18, 19 years old. So in terms of like, I've gone to so many meetings and things, and a lot of people start when they're 12, 13 years old, and that wasn't the case for me. It was a little bit older that I was. But it doesn't matter when you start, it doesn't matter when you stop. Like you said before, it's never too late to try to get a grip on this thing. So yeah, I've been sober now little over 5 years. February 13th, 2020, is my sobriety date, and it's like I said when I was about 18, 19 years old, I started to self-destruct. Before that, everything was I had a normal childhood, and baseball was my life. I wanted to grow up and play for the pros and play for my favorite sports team, which was the Baltimore Orioles. I really wanted to do that, and it had different plans. There was different plans for me, for sure.
Yeah, and I know from, reading through your bio before we got here, what I find very interesting is, kind of the root cause of your addiction, which I'll have you get into here in a minute, but ties very well into a lot of the themes of the show itself. I'll drop it in that in relation to, one of the most difficult topics we cover on the show. And one of the things I say is the most difficult part about the military is the conversation of suicide prevention and awareness, and as well as the people left behind. I've had some episodes on grieving and the complications of the grief when there's a suicide, the survivor's guilt, the blaming yourself. I've had very powerful episodes where people didn't refuse to go to the funeral of the person who took their life because they were just so mad at them and so upset at them. And so to to have those feelings build up into something that eventually turns into addiction is no surprise. And one of the things we talk about is it's really difficult to deal with those emotions. Those are one of the most complicated, human experiences I think are out there.
Oh, absolutely. And, just as in my case too, it was the loss of a very close family member of mine who died by suicide. And what's what's interesting in a way about that is that, nobody in the family knew about this. He confided in me about this and being 18, 19 years old, and I'd never experienced anything like that. And that was
Right.
further from my mind. I didn't know what to do with that information, but he would always say like, "Oh, I'm just joking. I'm not going to do that." And, so I would just brush it off. And, but he continued to say it, and it still never struck with me until it actually happened. And I'm left here with this information that I could have done something with, and now I'm, like you said, I'm here with the guilt and the what could I have done? I could have said something, he'd still be here, and all this, and blah blah blah. And I turned to the bottle because I've realized that it helped me to suppress all of that emotion, all of that guilt until it was nearly gone. And then by that time, I was full blown addict. And now, I'm living for that. And I had forgotten about the guilt and things like that. And, it took me down a road of stints in jail and DUIs and ruined relationships and just complete turmoil.
I understand a lot. One of the things we've discussed the most on the show, and something that I write about a lot in the books that I'm featured in and the other shows I've guested on, which is the how do you make that determination of does someone really need help? Because suicide prevention, I mean, obviously, right, you always want to save their life. That's the number one priority. But at the same time, you don't want to misinterpret it and then screw over their life. Maybe you report them and they lose their career or there's complications with their family or whatever it is. Especially, I speak about in particular the military. There's a lot more changes that
Mhm.
happen if someone is suicidal, right, compared to the civilian world. But it's like, how do you know if they're joking? Especially with people have really, and especially in the military, but even in general with the type of humor that circulates around the internet, the fact that we're kind of desensitized to dark humor and to making jokes like that. There's a lot of people who say, "Oh, I'm going to kill myself," or this or that, or there's a lot of people who say it to a less joking degree, but they still don't mean it. So it's like, how do we make that determination? And it's not a responsibility anyone should have to bear, to be honest, especially someone who's 18, right? At that point in your life, your sense of emotional awareness and self-awareness and analyzing those situations like you don't know, even now as grown men and women, that's a very difficult situation to analyze. And so I mean, you talk about it kind of spiraled out. I mean, how did it go with the whole process? If there was a funeral with the family and everything, did you ever admit to anyone that you were the only person who knew, or did you keep that locked up for a long time?
Yeah, no, I didn't tell anybody because the family, they were already in an uproar, not experienced this either, and they didn't
Right.
know how to. So it's his fault or her fault or this or that, and I'm like, there's no way I'm gonna put myself out there and be like, I knew about this when you guys are all blaming, and they
Right.
were blaming in a sense because they didn't know what's going on. So they don't know what to do. They weren't
Right.
equipped for this. So yeah, I held on to that information until I wrote my book, which actually came out last year, April of 2024. Nobody knew about it at all, and my family, my mom and my dad and everybody, they've read the book and they're like, I had no idea, and I'm like, exactly. That was my point. I wasn't wanting you all to know, but going through the therapy and the trauma therapy and you know, trying to get on this recovery journey, there was some things that I had to be vulnerable with, and I had to let this out. And I'd let it out to my therapist, and finally my wife, and it trickled down to where I could finally open up to my family after the book came out. But yeah, that I had to hold on to that for 20 plus years. That was a big part of my life that it was so hard to keep it in to where I would let it slip out a little bit here and there, like with my wife or even by myself. Like I would, I'm so inebriated and, you know, drunk that I'm just like talking to myself. And I know that this stuff is wanting to come out, but I just couldn't let it out.
Right, I was gonna say, so you mentioned getting that little bit of relief from the therapist to your wife, but you didn't have that big relief of everyone knows, or what I'm really curious about is, did you ever, even though your friend had passed on, did you ever have a conversation with them just to the sky or to the grave saying like, hey, I'm sorry, like Did you ever kind of confess that to them?
I did. Before I wanted to write my book, I was in the process of doing all that, but on a separate side, I actually wrote him a letter, you know, explaining everything that I felt
Right.
and not like blaming him, but saying, that I it was hard for me to deal with all of that without it was hard to write only because I didn't want to be like, this is your fault, you made me like this, when he
Right.
has no voice now. So it took a little bit of time, but I wrote it in the way that I knew that I was talking to him, and hopefully he knew as well. And because after it happened, you know, he I would have nightmares and legit nightmares to where I couldn't fall asleep because I
Mm.
could see these images and things like that, and start going through these scenarios in my mind that would just keep me awake. So, I had to write about that to him as well.
Right. And so now that you finished the book, are you completely relieved of all that guilt, or do you still struggle to some degree with everything that's happened?
So I don't really feel the guilt anymore. There are times when I'm like, dang, I wish he was here. I could talk to him about this and things like that, even after all these years. But I don't harbor that guilt anymore. I've learned through the trauma therapy, especially the trauma therapy helped a lot with trying to let those feelings go. Where I'm not 18, 19-year-old Damien anymore. I'm doing the steps to make me a better person in order to live with that. And now I'm able to focus on what the memories I did have back then of, him and things like that. And so yeah, I mean, it was a very long process. But I wouldn't say that I'm completely over it. I don't think I ever will be completely over it,
Right.
but it's a lot easier to deal with, being able to use my resources and things like that.
Yeah, and so we've talked about your emotional journey quite a bit here. And I want to kind of circle back around to how all these emotions played into the formation of addiction and kind of like where that started and how it kind of, snowballed into the 20 plus years of addiction.
Sure. Even back then, I was very introverted. I was very shy. I wanted to be the person that could be outgoing and talk to all these people and, just be like the life of the party and things like that. But I was not physically able to. I couldn't get over that hump. But I noticed that, when I would drink, I could let loose. I
Mm,
could be this person that I absolutely loved. It was the person that I was looking for that whole entire time, and it was deep down in there, and the alcohol let me bring it out. And so the guilt and everything aside, I had completely forgotten about that. Now I'm this Damien that everyone wants to be around. Everyone is like,
yeah.
oh, this is the fun Damien, and things like that. And it built my confidence up. And so, in order for me to function sometimes, I would have to drink so that that person could come out. And that got me, down that road where now I have to, in order for me to be that person all the time, I have to drink all the time.
Yeah.
So which also led to getting in, trouble with the law and things like that. But yeah, I loved the person that I was until I hated that person that I was.
Mm.
And,
Okay.
that I didn't start to hate that person until I'd say about 7, 8 years ago. Maybe a little bit longer than that, because I wanted to get sober. I could not look at myself in the mirror. And, when I did, I'm like, who is this person? I'm no longer at this point drinking to have fun. It's for survival. I could not live without it. So I'm back to a person that I don't want to be. I'm not outgoing because it's not fun. I'm just doing it to cure the shakes or, the
Right.
withdrawal symptoms and things like that. So I'm like, I could not, even look at myself in the mirror, and I wanted to get help, but I wanted to, but I didn't want to because somewhere deep inside, I was like, I could still be that one person that I used to like. And
Mm.
so I was at war with myself.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And what's interesting to me is how long it took to form that I hate myself. I saw a great clip from uh, one of the people I've worked with in addiction recovery and podcasting, and he talked about how he hated himself because he goes, there are people who had their wake up call so easy when it came to addiction. This thing happened and they were like, I gotta stop drinking, or they were just like, hey, I need to get sober. He goes, I had to go to jail. I had to get a DUI 3 times. Like he talked about all the stuff he went through. And for me, listening to your story, to know that you didn't hate yourself till more than halfway through. I mean, you mentioned already getting in trouble with the law. Like, how was none of that stuff a wake up call to you? Like, how did you process that stuff happening? Did you just brush it off because you were addicted, or like where was your mindset at when it came to like getting DUIs or getting in trouble with the law or even other skirmishes with people who were probably family or friends?
Yeah, yeah. So rock bottom, I learned, is not the same for everybody.
Yeah.
You would
Yeah.
think that my rock bottom would have been going to jail the first time, saying that this is a wake up call. I can't be doing this. I'm putting people's lives at
Right.
risk. And not to mention myself, but other people's lives that I am putting myself responsible for no reason. So when I got my first DUI in early 2004, I believe it was, and it was a basic slap on the wrist. And the weird thing about it too is, real quick, is I was driving at a high rate of speed down a back road that was only about 25, 30 miles an hour, but I'm doing like 60, 65.
Mm.
And I hit a parked car, and luckily it wasn't nobody. But
It
even
could
after
have been.
doing that,
Yeah.
yeah, it totally could have been. And you know, just having no regard for anyone's safety, that scares me to this day. I am not proud of that. I hold a lot of resentment to that person that I was, because it could have been bad. And I that's one of the pieces where I'm like, I hated that person. But I went to jail that night, and I basically got a slap on the wrist.
Mm.
And I don't know if it was that said, just go out and do it again, or if it was that I thought that I could just do it, you know? Like I thought that the laws didn't matter to me. I don't know what exactly it was.
Right.
And I know that I couldn't stop drinking back then, but I wasn't as far into addiction as, I was about to be, at that time. And then, 6 months later, I get another one. 6 months to the day, I get another one.
Wow.
And I spend a weekend down at Central Booking in our city, and that was even worse than the first one, in a worse jail, because the first time it was in county jail and this time is in city jail.
Mm.
And the atmosphere and the environment was so much worse than that
Right.
of
Of
the first
course.
one. I'd be like, now I'd be like, there's no way I want to go back to that. Even being in there for a weekend. So it's like, why didn't I wake up at that point? You know, my parents had to put their house up in order to get me out of jail, because they didn't have the funds to get to bail me out and things like that. And I,
Yeah.
so now other people are coming into my story. You know, now other people
Yeah.
are involved that should not be involved, and it's still not having me wake up. And after that, I go to my first rehab. I'm court ordered to do AA meetings and this outpatient treatment and therapy, and they got me doing all this stuff, and I'm just going through the motions. You know, I'm listening to people's story, and I'm like, when I would hear people's story in these meetings, I would I would pick out. They'd start naming off all these things that they've done in their in their past, and I'm like, listening for that one thing that I did not go through. So I could be like, now I'm not like that person. So I'm good. Like
Mm.
it was like
Yeah.
a
No, I
breath
get
of
it.
fresh air, like, whew, I'm not like that, So
Yeah.
it was bad.
No, I totally get that. It really is scary. I remember um we had a woman on my show who she was drinking so much she woke up, um, pulled over on the side of the road. She had been in being chased down by a cop from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, and she was blacked out the entire time until they got pulled over. And she goes, I mean, the fact that she didn't hit anyone, the fact that she was able to do that, that kind of stuff is scary. Like you said, that could have been a parked car, and there could have been, a mom and her kids getting out of it, or, you never know. And so it really
Absolutely.
is scary. And I wonder if we need harsher, penalties for drinking and driving, or to assume that anyone who gets pulled over and they're drinking and driving, that they're an addict. You have to treat them all
Hmm.
like addicts and send them, because I get it. Sometimes people just go to the bar and then they drive home, right? Doesn't make them an alcoholic, but you never know. At the same time, I think something you said that's really important is, as we've talked about a lot on the show, is AA and rehab only really works if you want to do it. If your heart's not in it, you're gonna, like you said, I really like what you said, trying to, put down the other people there, and not equate, And that's why
Yeah.
part of that when you come in is you're supposed to say, I'm so and so and I'm an alcoholic, right? You're supposed to set that equality when you come in, but you
Yeah.
like you said, I like how you said it, going through the motions. It's court ordered. You know,
Yep.
why are you here? I'm here because the court told me to. So
Yep.
I think it's only as effective as, your willingness to hold yourself accountable and to want help. And, I think what you've highlighted here is something that is very known about addicts is it makes you into a very selfish person, even when other people get involved, it's kind of like, well, who cares? Or you'll be like, I didn't ask for their help, It's like
Yeah.
you always try to find some way to justify your behavior, continue drinking and put yourself up. So you talk about starting to hate that person at some point. Is that what pushed you towards wanting to recover in sobriety?
I was finally ready. And so it started affecting. So let me backtrack a little bit. My drinking wasn't affecting anything in my life. I would always hear people talk about, like, I've lost my job and my house and my wife and my car and blah blah blah, all this stuff.
Hmm.
And you know, I had never lost that. And I think
Mm,
that was, fueling this, because I hadn't gotten to that part yet. I haven't gotten that far to where it's affecting my life than I thought, but it
mm.
was affecting everything. So
Right.
now at this point, I hadn't lost my job and or anything like that, but I was drinking at work because I could not go a whole day without it. I couldn't go more than an hour
Right.
without it. So, I'm drinking at work, and now they're starting to notice. So now I could potentially lose that job that I hadn't lost yet. I could potentially, if I lose that, I'll lose my house, I'll lose my car, I'll lose my wife. It'll all snowball down. But I still didn't care. Like you were saying before too, this is a very selfish disease, and we don't care, as harsh as it is, um, and as shameful as that is. We just don't. All we need is that next fix, no matter what it is. So it started getting to me. People are noticing at my job. My wife is noticing. My family, my daughters, they were young at the time, but they still knew what was going on, and so they're starting to notice. And I remember going into my job one day, and they, for some reason, I had broken down. I started getting really emotional, and I started shaking really bad. So I went out to my car. I had a few drinks to calm my nerves and bring me back to normal. And I went back in, and I go into my supervisor, and I'm like, "Listen, I gotta go. I need some help." And he was like, "I'm glad you actually came in here and said that, because if you would have just come down and sat at your desk, you would be gone right now." So I would have lost my job at that point. And at that moment, I called this, talked to them, and I was like, I'm going to call rehab. And I did not call a rehab. I called a therapist, and I went out on short-term disability. And I go to this therapist. Short term was 30 days. So I'm out of work now for 30 days, but I'm still getting paid. Um, I stayed sober for a week in that 30 days. I went to therapy, but I only stayed sober for a week. I said I was going to do AA, and I was going to do all this stuff. Didn't do any of it.
Right.
I go back to I go back to work. All I did in that 30 days was figure out how I can mask it even more to where maybe they won't know. So I go back to work, and things are different. I'm able to contain myself, but still I'm drinking at my job, and I'm still able
Yeah.
to contain myself. But it wasn't even at that point. It wasn't until I'll skip ahead a little bit, because I go back and forth with this, trying to get
Yeah, that
sober, and then I
cycle.
fall
Yeah.
off. Yeah, it's a whole big cycle, but I tried about 5 or 6 times. I just still wasn't ready. It wasn't until I want to say early 2020, January, maybe even 2019. But I started to really want to get sober, but I don't know how to do it at this point. And then in February of 2020, I wanted to take my own life. That was when I realized I need to do something, because that wasn't like me at all. And even drunk me knew that that wasn't somebody that I wanted to be. And living past, what happened with our family and what happened to me. Why would I'm going to do this now to my kids and my wife?
Right.
And so all that started to come back. And but I was serious, because the disease was telling me that the only way out of this is not rehab. You tried that. It's not therapy. You tried that.
Mm.
The only way out is by taking yourself out. And
Wow.
I was very serious about that. And what I did was that day, I was in the process of texting my wife, because I couldn't hear her voice. I didn't want to hear her voice, so I didn't want to call. I was in the process of texting her, telling her that she needs to pick up the kids, because I'm not going to be able to. And I was going to tell her everything that's going on. And I had this phone number of this pastor in my phone, and I had never called him before, but my dad gave it to me to have me call him at one point. And I was like, I'll take his number, but I ain't calling him. And I accidentally called him in the process of me texting her, and I completely froze. And I couldn't hang up. I couldn't do anything. And then he answers, and something came over me, and I just break down. I'm like, I need help. I know you're not equipped for this, and I just need something. And he agreed to meet with me at this coffee shop down the street from my house. And it was at that moment he asked me to pray, and I had never done that before. God and myself had no relationship. I believed, and that was as far as it got. I never prayed before, and I prayed that day, and it felt good, and I felt so different. This time was going to be different, and I went home. I texted my wife. I still didn't call her. I texted her, and I was like, "You got to pick up the kids. I'm in no, no mindset to be able to do that." Um, And then I called a rehab here locally to me. It's called Ashley Treatment Center, right down the road from me. And I set me a date to go in. They wanted me to go in that day, and they were like, "Do you need a detox?" And I should have. I totally should have gone. And I said no because they wanted me to go to that day. That disease was telling me still, you can beat this. You don't need to go today. Just let them. They had a bed waiting for me. It was like 5 days from that day. So I took that one instead of going that day because I still, in my mind, thought that I could beat this. And so I set it up and I actually did the next day. I stayed sober. Um, I still should have detoxed, should not have gone through it by myself. My wife stayed
Right.
here with me in case something were to happen, seizures and things like that. But I did. I got sober on my own, and that day came when I was supposed to go to rehab, and I'm like, I don't know if I actually need it, and it's starting to tell me again,
Yeah.
you don't need to do this. And but I did. I kept that date. I kept it, and I went. And the whole ride there, my wife took me. I'm thinking, how can I get out of this? Maybe if I just jump out of this car right here on the on
Right.
the
Right.
road,
Yeah.
run into the woods, hide for a couple of days, they won't find me. This is the kind of crazy thinking that I'm going through, and I'm literally thinking this stuff that it actually could happen. But nonetheless, I did end up getting there, and you know, that was the best decision I ever made.
Right. And then fast forward through your sobriety, we're here today. You're now podcast guesting and you wrote Breaking the Silence. So, what is the main purpose and message with that? I assume to kind of help us who are addicted or the loved ones of addicted individuals, kind of shortcut that, 20 plus years and to get help sooner. So, what is this silence you're referring to that we're supposed to be breaking, with your book and with these conversations?
Yeah, breaking the silence to me means speaking up. I suffered in silence for so long. I hid it or tried to for so long. I know I needed help for so many years, but I never spoke up because I didn't want people to look at me different. I didn't want to be judged. I didn't want people to say, well, you're this or you're that, and you've lied so many times. How can I trust you? And all this stuff. Just I'm gonna judge you. So breaking the silence for me is speaking up, holding yourself accountable, and sticking to the goal that you need to set for yourself, and that is to get sober sooner rather than later. Of course, it's okay to do it later. It's just do it. But the thing is that you don't want to wait too long. You don't want to get to the point to where it has such a control over you that it's telling you that you don't need to be here anymore. So that to me is what breaking the silence is. Um, and for those out there who who love someone who is going through this, it is a battle. It really is. And I know the things that I put my wife through. She was the closest one to me. So I know what she had to go through in order to stick with me. She shouldn't have stuck with me. And I tell her that all the time. And she saw something in me that nobody else did, or at least that I didn't see. And that's why she stuck with me. But, the thing is that you have to be patient as well. If you love someone with an addiction, you have to be patient and you have to know that their recovery must come first. That
Right.
is the biggest thing because we don't think about that kind of stuff. Especially loved ones. They don't think about that if they that their recovery must come first.
Right. And I think it's so important to have these conversations, especially from people who went through it. I think, like you said, a lot of addicts or alcoholics, they suffer in silence for many reasons. One of them that you kind of mentioned is the functioning alcoholic slash addicted individual, right? They're still going to work. They still have the family life. They still have the car and the house, and they're performing well, so people don't know, right? And then secondly, like you said, that fear of being judged or looked at, and we definitely need to help have these conversations more and to help, kind of like break down the stigma that, that alcoholics and addicts are bad people, that that they're villains or that they're, like we said, yeah, it's selfish, but it's also not, this malicious selfishness necessarily that you're like a bad, terrible person, right? It's like we said, it's developed into a physical disease,
Yeah.
so a dependency. And so who should really read your book? It sounds like it's for not just addicted individuals, but also for their loved ones as well, correct?
Yeah, yeah, it's for anyone. It goes through the whole story of, from beginning to end. Even in the back of the book, I put in some accountability questions that I actually used for myself. That it's not like a homework piece, but it helps you to get
Right.
real with yourself. And when you can put those feelings and those real thoughts on paper, it makes it more real. And you look at it and you're like, wow, that's really how I feel. Because you have nobody to lie to, you have nobody to impress, you have nobody
Right.
to do anything with except yourself.
Yeah, and then the last question that I want to leave us here with is, I mean, what is your life looking like now? Are you still struggling with temptation, with thoughts of addiction, with all the emotional turmoil and, your new life, or have you gladly embraced sobriety and you are going at it pretty strong every day? I know it's been about 5 years. So what is that looking like right now?
Yeah, so I'm I wanted to, when I got into recovery, I wanted to hit it head on and just, go all out. Because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it right and I was going to do it for good. And so I stay busy with like doing meetings. I do speaking engagements. I have I am a mentor at our local detention center.
Mm.
And I partner with them to mentor inmates who are in there for drug and alcohol offenses and things like that. So I also I started a group at my job. The job that I almost lost, I am still there. I, I was very upfront with them and told them what was happening with me, and they decided to keep me, thankfully. So I started a group there, and I help others who are at my job who are trying or struggling in silence because they're afraid that their supervisor or whatever will reprimand them. I wanted to let them know that that's not the case. So, helping out as many people as I can, doing these podcasts, getting the word out, and letting them know that you're not alone. That's the main thing, is that I wanted people to know that they are not alone.
Right, and I really appreciate that. Like I said, it's important for us to have these conversations, which can be very difficult for people to have. So I appreciate your vulnerability, your accountability, and your honesty. And we're gonna have your link tree in the description below so people can find some of your other content, to find your book, most importantly. And I just want to thank you again for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on. I really do.
Sailing through the ocean blue, nuclear reactors my crew, guiding the ship, the stars as our guide. Through the waves we ride, jokes and laughter fill the air. On this voyage we have to share, working together, side by side. As one family we will abide. In the heart of the ship we reside, nuclear operators with pride, powering the vessel with every stride. Our mission, a source of great pride.